Hello and welcome. My name is Maureen McCarthy, and I'm the current president of City Club. Our mission is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. For our June program, we welcomed Ambassador James F. Collins, one of America's most respected foreign diplomats. His experience in Russia, the Middle East, and Asia will inform his program called Can a Divided America Produce a Foreign Policy for the 21st Century? We hope you can join us. As always, I'd like to thank all the volunteers who make today's program possible. I'd also like to thank KMRE Radio Board member Robert Clark, who's producing today's program, as well as BTV10, who will be broadcasting it for their viewers. If you know of others who had to miss the meeting today, please let them know that they can find it next week at our website, bellinghamcityclub.org. And before this great big crowd, I would like to acknowledge our business sponsors. They are Larson Gross, Lumley Commercial Company, Danny Neal of the Molliot Group, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, and the Whatcom Community Foundation. And finally, I would like to introduce Dean Wright, who will introduce today's speaker and moderate our program. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. We have a really exciting program today, and I'm sure our members agree, judging by the near record number of people in our audience. And they're here for a good reason. We have as our guest, America's foremost travel writer, Rick Steves. Rick has referred to himself as a teacher of travel, and countless numbers of us think of ourselves as his students, as we use his guidebooks, take his tours, or watch his television programs. Rick taught his first travel course on his university campus in the 1970s, and then founded Rick Steves Europe in his hometown of Edmonds. Rick produces a best-selling series of guidebooks and is the author of Travel as a Political Act. He operates a tour company that brings 30,000 people to Europe each year. A strong supporter of public broadcasting, he produces and hosts television programs and radio programs that are seen across the country. Rick spends about 4 months a year doing research in Europe, though I'm sure this past year that was a challenge. As we come out of this pandemic, and as Europe prepares to once again put out the welcome mat for American travelers, I can think of no one better to talk to about the future of travel. Rick Steves, welcome.
Thank you, Dean. It's so good to be with you. Wish I was there in person, but we got to be thankful for this technology where we can all quite conveniently get together and do the mission of the Bellingham City Club, share ideas.
Let's start with a broad question. Why should we travel anyway? What good does it do us?
Boy, oh boy, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. In fact, you mentioned in your introduction that I spend in normal times 100 days a year in Europe working on my beat. You know, I just do Europe. For me, that's the wading pool for world exploration, even though my favorite country would probably be India, I think, far from Europe. But my mission really with my 100 colleagues here in Edmonds, just north of Seattle, is to equip and inspire Americans to venture beyond Orlando. That's what I really am excited about, getting people out there. And you learn so much about your home by leaving it and looking at it from a distance. You learn about yourself also. So last summer, we just shut down with COVID, and I've got 100 people on my payroll here, no revenue. And we're just hunkered down waiting for this to get through. And we've been thinking a lot about the value of travel. And it's an ethical thing for me to do as an employer to keep my team together in bad years. They help me be a profitable business in good years. So we need each other. And we've kept our team together. And we've been thinking about the value of travel. And I've thought about it a lot. In fact, the only show I've made since COVID is a show called Why We Travel. And it was sort of a love note to travel. And I'd like to play for you, just to get us in the mood, the last 3.5 minutes of this half-hour show. And if I can share my screen, I think we can pull this off. And this is just filmed, the on camera here was filmed on campus at the University of Washington because I couldn't get to Europe. And but these are images of why we travel. And the last little section is about connecting. So before we get deeper into our conversation, Dean, let's just go imagine why we travel here with the help of this video clip. Again, it's just about 3 minutes.
By traveling thoughtfully, we connect. Even for those of us who can only travel as a state of mind, travel can result in a deeper connection. Travel connects us face to face with reality. It's not virtual. It's not through a viewfinder. Travel is candid, honest, being in the moment.
Okay. Thank you.
In a world hungry for authenticity, we yearn for connection.
But now she's quite big. She's like you, about like that, yeah.
Travelers connect with different cultures, different people. On the road, strangers are just friends we've yet to meet. Travel frees us from routine. It creates room for serendipity.
Okay, so now I'm ready to be a shepherd.
Serendipity leads to connections. Travel forces us to bend and to flex. It makes us more tolerant and inspires us to celebrate diversity. The lessons I've gained from exploring Europe, the land of my heritage, are universal. For me, these lessons are affirmed and then stretched when traveling further afield. As a child ventures beyond his backyard, I ventured beyond Europe. Year after year, I pushed my boundaries. The world opened wide with a montage of wonders and lessons learned. Traveling beyond my comfort zone, culture shock became constructive. The growing pains of a broadening perspective, my ethnocentrism challenged. The celebration of difference and oneness at the same time. The recognition that love is love in their home just as in mine.
I think this is a beautiful, beautiful welcome here.
Through travel, we see a world filled with joy, with compassion, and with good people. We learn the more we reach out, the more we receive. We learn that we all share the same world.
Nice.
And we all share the same window of time. Travelers seek bridges rather than walls. Every wall has two sides and two narratives. For one to be truly understood, both must be heard. Traveling, we realize the challenges of our future will be blind to borders and best overcome not by conflict and walls, but by community and bridges. There's so much fear these days. The flip side of fear? It's understanding. And we gain understanding when we travel.
What is this? The celebration of Obama's.
Travel is more than a holiday. It gives us new experiences, acts as our greatest teacher, makes our lives more meaningful, and connects us with a global family. We can't all travel physically, but anyone can live with a traveler's mindset. It's a choice. Travel makes us more comfortable with the world, our hearts bigger, and our lives richer. And it makes us happier. And that is why we travel.
Oh man, I just love those images. We were in Ethiopia, Guatemala, Egypt, Turkey, just Morocco, India, places that just are so wonderful at broadening your perspective. As I said, culture shock is the growing pains of a broadening perspective. And I think a broadening perspective is really important as our world gets smaller and smaller and more complicated.
Well, that certainly put me in the mood to travel, and I'm sure it did the same for our audience. You mentioned at the beginning that you want Americans to get beyond Orlando. Fewer than 45% of Americans have passports. I mean, is that because as a nation we lack curiosity or wanderlust, or is it just because we have so much to see within our borders? What can be done to get more passports in people?
Well, I think a big part of that might be economic. Probably half our nation doesn't have enough money to get on an airplane and fly to Europe for their vacation. And we have a big gap between the privileged and the less privileged. A lot of it is education. I'm really concerned lately, Dean, about how in our society we are funding education that helps us have vocational skills, and we're doing that at the expense of education that creates creative thinkers, liberal arts education. It saddens me that people are not able to be critical thinkers. Because they haven't had any education that gives them the confidence and the wherewithal to look at things from their own perspective. Media is so important these days, and media is a powerful shaper of people's viewpoints. I just think, well, you look at all the fear in our society these days. When I started teaching, people said, bon voyage. Now what do they say? They say, have a safe trip. They say, have a safe trip. When somebody tells me I have a safe trip, I'm inclined to say, well, you have a safe stay at home, because where I'm going statistically is safer than where you're staying, but your worldview is shaped by commercial TV news and mine is shaped by actual travel. So I just think fear is for people who don't get out very much. The flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain understanding when we travel. I wish everybody could travel. I think if the world wanted to make a very smart investment, this sounds kind of goofy, but the world would collectively create a fund and give every American a little gap trip before school and they get back into their mortgages and their families and their occupation, to get out there and not go to Cancun, not go to Bermuda, but to get out there and have some reality travel, just 1 month. If every American had to travel before they could vote, we would have a much stronger country and the world would be better off for it. So yeah, a lot of Americans don't have the curiosity, they don't have the economic wherewithal, and they just don't have the privilege to be able to travel. I may have never traveled had my father, who was a piano tuner in Seattle, decide to import pianos from Germany. And he was just a normal guy. He was a band director that became a piano tuner, that somebody said, you should import pianos from Germany. And one day I came home from school and my dad said, son, we're going to Germany to see the piano factories. And I thought, Dad, that's a loony idea. But I went over there and it changed my world. Had he not done that, who knows? I might have been somebody who didn't have a passport.
Was that when you decided that you wanted to be a travel teacher? Was that your aha moment?
Well, that was when I was 14 years old, Dean, 1969. And when I think back on that, I was a very egocentric, ethnocentric kid, like most 14-year-old Americans. And I got over there and I was in the park in Oslo. I always love to tell this story. If you're a Norwegian heritage, there's a wonderful park behind the palace called Frogner Park, filled with work by Gustav Vigeland. And it's a vast park. And I remember I was a kid looking up at my parents and they were loving me so kind of ridiculously. I mean, it was like amazing how they were compromising on their adult trip of a lifetime by taking their kid along. And I realized I just was, I was the center of their world. And I looked around that park and it was filled with families just like mine, with parents loving their kids as much as my parents loved me. And I thought, whoa, this world is home to billions of equally precious little kids like me. And I'm no better than any of the other ones. And then later on in that same trip, I was on the carpet in front of the TV with my cousins in Bergen, and we were watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon landing. And when I think back on it, I'm kind of impressed that I was thoughtful enough to realize that back home, all my friends were waving American flags and saying, yay, United States. And I was in Norway realizing that the whole world was celebrating this. And this was more than an American accomplishment. This was a human accomplishment. And we were all in it together. So you get those two experiences I just talked about there. For a kid, with no heightened sensibilities, but it was just like obvious. It hit me. There's that global sensibility you get when you leave home and you look at it from a distance. A few years later, I was in the train station in Copenhagen with my mom and dad. And this was when I was literally on my mom's passport. Back then, the mother and the child could have the one photo mugshot on one passport. I couldn't go anywhere without my mom. And I was looking at kids a couple years older than me in this classic train station in Copenhagen. And they had their Eurail passes, and they had their rucksacks, and they had no parents in sight, and they had exciting destinations clicking up on the reader board. And all I could think is, man, this is my playground and I don't need my parents. I'm going to Europe every year after this, and I have. And then for a couple of years, I was just traveling for kicks. I was a piano teacher. Kids wouldn't practice in the summer. I'm not going to struggle with that. I'm going to see you in September. I'm going to Europe. And I was learning from my mistakes, and I was becoming a good traveler, and I was on a very tight budget. And I saw other people making the same mistakes I had made. And I thought, if I could just package the lesson from these mistakes into a talk or a guidebook or something, I could let other people learn from my mistakes rather than their own and have a better trip. And I'd have a good excuse to go back to Europe every year and update my material. So I started doing that. And then I was discovering these amazing places, the Cinque Terre, Gimmelwald, high in the Alps, where everybody has the same last name in this beautiful little alpine community. Your own private Stonehenge, not Stonehenge with barbed wire and Santa cans and tour guides with blowhorns, but your own private stone circle that you have to hike into. And it's just you and these, wild ponies at sunset. And I just thought, there are great places that can be discovered and shared. And that's what a travel writer can do. And I decided kind of then and there, and that was when I must have been, 20 years old or something, that I think I found my niche. I'm gonna travel and take notes and come home and share that with my neighbors. And I've been doing that ever since. I've got the same mission now I had back then, but I've got 100 wonderful colleagues at Rick Steves Europe here in Edmonds, and I've got technology beyond my wildest dreams to amplify my teaching. And but I'm doing essentially the same thing I've always done, help people travel. But I mean, if I look back on it, I've been at this for 3 or 4 decades. I didn't have a grand plan, but I've been sort of a Rick Steves hierarchy of travel needs, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of travel needs, if I could put myself in that area. For the first decade, I was just on the bottom rung, teaching people how to pack light and get a hotel and a restaurant and catch the train, basic stuff. I used to come up to Bellingham to the Parks and Rec department and give this talk back in the 80s. And then in the 90s, it was all about, I thought, well, you can catch the train and pack light. Let's slide up that hierarchy of travel needs. And I was enthusiastic about teaching history and art and culture and wine and cuisine. I wrote a book called Europe 101, History and Art for Travelers. And that's what I like to teach. And then since 9/11, it occurs to me, I have slid to what I consider the top of that traveler's hierarchy of needs. And that is traveling in a way that broadens your perspective, that gets you out of your comfort zone and lets you come home with the most beautiful souvenir. And that is an empathy for the other 96% of humanity. And that's what I found most exciting. And I call that travel as a political act. And I wrote this book. And now when I go around the country and talk, if they hire me to talk about, train passes and good restaurants, I'm happy to do that. But I'd much rather talk about the transformational experiences I've had traveling in places that really challenge truths I was raised to think are self-evident and God-given. I just love that. I love the whole thought that Thomas Jefferson said, travel makes a person wiser, if less happy. And Mohammed said, don't tell me how educated you are, tell me how much you've traveled.
That's an interesting point about the hierarchy of teaching that you've done. And one of the things that struck me in your guidebooks and your television programs is they really showcase your gift for presenting history and culture in an accessible way for people. You're able to popularize culture, if you will, which I think is a great gift. What do you think prepared you for that?
That's a good question. And part of it, and I think you're right. I'm not a scholar, but I'm a good teacher. You don't need to be a scholar to turn people on to history and help people raise their appreciation of it. And it's kind of related to my decade as a piano teacher. I'm not a great piano player, but I was a great piano teacher. And parents would drag their kids into my piano studio with tear-stained cheeks, and they didn't want to learn Bach or Beethoven. They wanted to do boogies and Beatles. And I thought, great, let's start out with the boogies and the Beatles, and we'll work into Bach and Beethoven. And I developed a good knack for doing that. Also, for 25 years, I had the bully pulpit. I was a tour guide with 25 people on my bus, and I had the microphone. And I had an agenda, a teaching agenda, but I learned through experience, you have to teach people thoughtfully and not hit them on the head with the ideas you want them to go home with. So that was really helpful. But I consider myself a teacher, and the road is my classroom, and I've really enjoyed that.
Let's get back to the pandemic for a minute. You clearly certainly had an impact on your business. It has an impact on all of us as we travel. It's affected business, it's affected education. In some ways, perhaps some permanent changes are coming in the way educators educate. We've seen that we can do so many things remotely now that maybe we don't have to do in person. What permanent changes do you think the pandemic has brought or will bring to travel?
Well, those, I like to look for what I call Corona bonuses. And to be able to meet like this is a Corona bonus. I probably might not have had the time to come up to Bellingham, but I can certainly log on now and enjoy this conversation. When we travel, I think that there'll be a sort of a smarter sensibility about just staying healthy. I mean, 2 years ago, when I saw somebody with a mask from Asia, I didn't have much respect for that. I just thought, come on, you need to be exposed to the world for your immune system. But I think makes a lot of sense. And I think when people are wearing a mask in Pacific Rim countries, they're doing it because they're considerate about people who are sitting next to them. They might have a cold and they don't want to share that cold. And I know as a tour guide, it's a big challenge for us on our buses. We have 25 people on a Rick Steves tour bus, 50 seats. There's still room to spread out. But if somebody gets a cold, the challenge is not to let that cold spread. And going forward, I would imagine people will travel with a mask, and they'll have a mask not only to protect themselves from others, but to protect others from themselves if they need to do a little bit of a mask-related quarantine. That's a good thing. But I think the essence of travel is people. That's the mark of a good trip, is how many people do you meet. And social distancing and Rick Steves style of travel have nothing to do with each other. And I'm pretty conservative. About getting out of this COVID time and into the regular travel, but we are on a glide path to normalcy. And I don't want to fly to Amsterdam right now to sit in a bubble and not get somebody else's germs. I want to wait a few months. So when I go to Europe, all of Europe is open, not just Cyprus and Greece and Iceland, but all of Europe is open. It's not, when Europe is partially open, in my mind, as a tour organizer and a travel teacher, Europe is not open. I'm not saying, oh, go to Greece right now because the Acropolis is not crowded. It'll be great. No, let's stay home, take care of our neighbors, get our shots. Let's wait till we can travel freely in Europe with no stress of border crossings being closed down and quarantine concerns and this kind of thing. And then when I go to Europe, I go to Paris to have my cheeks kissed. And I go to Rome to pack into the piazza with other human beings, have that gelato, lick that gelato, and walk with all the generations up and down the pedestrian boulevard as we do the passeggiata or the paseo. I go to Ireland to pack into a pub and clink glasses with local people who really believe that strangers are just friends who've yet to meet. That's what travel's all about. And we'll have it. It's not pie in the sky wishful thinking. It is simple science that as we get vaccinated and as Europe gets vaccinated, we become safe with each other. And as a businessman, I've been thinking about this. You got to pack the house. You got to pack the concert hall. You got to pack the airplane. You got to pack the hotel. You got to pack the restaurant. And I got to pack the tour bus in order to be profitable, to be viable. And everybody needs viable businesses. just in my little world as a tour operator, I've got to pay my guides really well because they're really good. I've got to pay a lot of money to have good hotels, good restaurants, good experiences. I've got to have a product that is a good and affordable value before any traveler would ever book a tour with me. And I've got to design all of that in a way where I can make a profit so I can do it again with enthusiasm. Well, that requires a certain amount of efficiency, and it is doable. We took 30,000 people on 1,500 tours in 2019. It was a very good value, paid my guides the best of any tour company in Europe, as far as I know. And I made plenty of money because we're very efficient. It's called fill rate. And when I hear of a restaurant that can have 25% capacity, or when I go to an arena and there's, people here and people there and people over there, or if I am so sorry for people who entertain on stage when you don't have the energy of a packed house, but just a few people here and there, that's not the goal. The goal is to pack the house, and we'll get there when we get vaccinated. That's why I'm pretty enthusiastic about the whole idea about let's really give people a strong incentive to embrace science and put their quirky hangups aside. We've all got quirky hangups. I've got my quirky hangups, but we don't have the privilege of imposing our quirkiness on our community at the expense of community health. We need to get our shots so we as a community can get vaccinated. When I got my second shot, all of my endorphins were just doing flip-flops. We were all so happy inside me, and it wasn't a selfish happiness. It was so interesting. It was a communal happiness. I was part of a movement of people that were getting vaccinated so our entire community could have this power against the virus. And I think we need to see it that way. And I think we will. Europe had a very slow rollout for their vaccines. And it was a good example of the EU being just a bunch of bumbling different organizations debating and not getting anything done. And they're realizing that's expensive. And right now, my European friends are telling me Europe got the message. It's going to be cohesive, it's going to be top down, and it's going to be pedal to the metal to get that continent vaccinated, because the number one source of foreign revenue and a number one source of employment in many parts of Europe is tourism. And they don't have the luxury of having 6 months of lost income because of their inability to get their vaccines.
Well, we're already seeing some questions that are coming in, and one is related to just what you were speaking about. How will vaccine passports or COVID cards be standardized? And do you have any sense of how airlines and governments are going to make that work?
I just got a phone call a couple of weeks ago from Congressman Rick Larson, and he was asking me what my thoughts were on vaccine passports and reminding me that our government is working very hard right now to try to innovate something, because we've got to figure it out. So they're working on it, and they recognize the importance of that. I'm fascinated by how people are so inclined to politicize things, or inclined just to be curmudgeonly about things. This is a passport, and this is a yellow international certificate of vaccination. I needed one of these 40 years ago in order to go to Spain and to go to Germany, because they wanted to be sure I had my shots. So in my passport, for many years, I had my yellow international certificate of vaccination. Nobody politicized that. Nobody questioned it. It was just common sense. Spain doesn't want you coming into their country unless you got your shot. They don't care about you. They care about their own citizens. And they don't want to let you in until you can substantiate that you were diligent in getting that. This particular yellow international certificate of vaccination, I like to sing that because when I was a kid, it was always, do you have your yellow international certificate of vaccination? Because you can't get into Afghanistan without this thing. And I needed it to get into Afghanistan when I was a kid. But this one is just a year or two old. I had to get it before going to Ethiopia. And I had that. I had it in my passport, and they let me in. So how do we organize that? We need something that is universally acceptable. We need something that is a standard. We need something that is not just a scam, but reliable. And that is what we're working on. Now, my staff, we've got, just next week, we're opening the floodgates. We've got 15 or 20,000 people on the waiting list for our Rick Steves tours, but I've not been confident enough to start taking deposits again. I think I mentioned we had to send back 24,000 deposits in 2020. It was heartbreaking in so many ways. And we're going to not open up until we're confident. So we're confident that we can start selling tours. In our first tours that we're opening right now are February 2022. And I think it's very realistic. It's very conservative to think that we'll be able to responsibly and confidently promise that kind of a experience if we wait that long, given the trajectory of our countries with the vaccines and everything here on both sides of the Atlantic. But the question is, for us, will we require vaccinations? Personally, if it was just my simplistic, unlegal thinking, I'd like to say every guide, every bus driver, and every tourist on a Rick Steves bus is vaccinated. But I don't think it's that easy. But my staff is reminding me it's probably not going to be an issue because Europe will probably require a vaccine for us to be able to travel freely around Europe anyways. So they'll set the standard and we will meet that standard. But going forward, it's just there's a new disease out there. And thank God we've got a vaccine. And, over time, it's going to become old news and we'll look at it in the rear view mirror and say, yeah, wow, COVID, that was quite a time, but we're traveling on. So I think it's realistic to think that in 2022, we'll look back and think of it as a done deal.
I was so happy to see that yellow card. That brought back great memories for me. I had to have one when I traveled to Malaysia and Thailand 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to it, but it's just a great concept.
Yeah, well, we've got, in the old days, we probably have these up in our souvenir boxes in the attic, but you had all your shots listed right here. And it was kind of news to me because I generally don't travel to places where you need a shot, but we were filming in Ethiopia and we had to have our shots before they let us in. So I had that at the airport, and then it is welcome, Mr. Steves.
Great. So when we're thinking about the pandemic, clearly, as you say, had a big impact on your business, a big impact on your routines, a big impact on your television productions. During the pandemic, where did you dream of traveling when you were able to do it again? Was there one spot you said, oh my gosh, I so wish this were over? And when it's over, this is where I'm going to go. Where did you dream of going?
Well, I'm a weird character in that regard because I dream of work. I don't go on vacations. I spend 100 days a year in Europe and people think, oh, that must be nice. But I'm updating guidebooks, I'm making TV shows, and I'm leading tours. And if somebody gave me an all expensive paid trip to a wonderful resort in the South Pacific, which I'd love to go to, by the way, my first thought would be, 10 days, I should really go to Portugal and update my guidebook to Portugal. Or 10 days, 12 days, I could make 2 TV shows. And we had 2 TV shows written, the scripts, we had permissions, we had the crew booked up for Poland before COVID hit. And that's what I would do. We've got 2 shows ready to go for Iceland also. But I've been thinking during COVID, where would I go if I was actually a normal person and went on vacation to Europe? The 2 places I'd go for vacation, and I'm fantasizing about this with my girlfriend, Shelley, a canal barge trip down the canal in Burgundy in France, with all the sunflowers and the vineyards and the old toll path where you get the bicycle, you can just bike along, and the blocks that you hand crank open, and your captain on the barge trip is actually more of a chef than a captain, because anybody can captain a barge down a canal, but he and his first mate would make great French cuisine for us. That'd be fun. I'd also like to go, the last place we filmed before COVID stopped us was in the French Alps, and the highest mountain in Europe is Mont Blanc, taller than Mount Rainier. And there is a classic long distance hike around Mont Blanc. It's called the Tour du Mont Blanc, 100 miles, 10 days. And we filmed it. We just faked like we were hiking it. We hiked it for 2 days. And there are these wonderful mountain lodges, a day's hike apart. And it's a popular hike. So you got to get your reservations in advance. So you got your spot, and they're rustic and they're high in the mountains. They serve wonderful rustic high altitude cuisine. And after hiking all day, you come in with these new friends and the sun on your face and a big appetite, and you enjoy rustic, beautiful cuisine. And you're hiking through France, Switzerland, and Italy as you go around. every morning, a wonderful van comes and picks up your bag and drives it to the next stop. So you're just kind of waltzing through the Alps, working up an appetite until you come into your next mountain lodge. So that would be a cool trip. That's the Tour de Mont Blanc. There's a wonderful travel writer just south of Bellingham, Cassandra Overby. She writes a book called Great Trails of Europe or something like that. Her thing is hiking in Europe. So we flew her over and she was our guide and our fixer for this filming experience. And anybody who wants to see that little bit, or the Burgundy canals, I should remind you, you can always go to my website, ricksteves.com. There's a program we've designed for teachers called Classroom Europe, where I've broken 150 shows into 500 little 5-minute teachable clips. The thing we rolled just a moment ago, I accessed in less than a minute by just going to Classroom Europe and typing in where we travel. But you could type in Mont Blanc or Burgundy Canal and watch all of those clips if you wanted to. And they're designed for homeschooling parents and teachers to help their kids get more of a travel impact on their curriculum. But where would I travel when this is all over? The perfect answer for that is we've just produced a TV show called Europe Awaits. And public television, it's such a timely show. And it's, I think, 5 destinations that I cobbled together into a 2-hour TV special. And these are destinations that are good for your travel and soul and good for your wanderlust when we come out of COVID. Getting away from the crowds, getting close to nature, not going to the Instagram destination things where everybody gets their selfie, but going to places where you can connect with the culture and the cuisine and the fine living and away from the rat race. In so many cases, people are going to the famous place and they're neglecting the second cities. Second cities, sure, go to Edinburgh, but consider Glasgow. Sure, go to Munich, but consider Hamburg. Sure, go to Paris, but consider Lyon or Marseille. What we're doing in this TV special, I picked some of these kind of destinations. So sure, go to Lisbon, but Porto, 2 hours north in Portugal. It's got this wonderful rough edge and a patina of age, and it's right where all of the beautiful velvety port wine comes to age. And there's no tourism there. It's just you and the local people, and it's half the price of Lisbon. So what I've cobbled together, Dean, for this show is, let me just think of it, Sicily, Mykonos, the Cotswold villages, Tuscany, staying in a farmhouse bed and breakfast, Porto in Portugal, and Romania. The most traditional folk life anywhere is in Romania. And when was the last time you got an email from Romania? You know, what do we know about Romania? And we were there filming and it was just great. And very exciting for us. It's the first time we've ever had common carriage. I've been making TV for 30 years for public television, but I don't get common carriage. But on June 7th, almost every station in the country is going to run this special, Europe Awaits, Monday, June 7th at 7 o'clock on KCTS 9. But throughout the whole country, we got common carriage because this is really a timely celebration of where we're going to go once we get out of COVID.
Well, you certainly anticipated a question. I was going to ask you about Europe Awaits, which, as you say, is going to be on PBS stations on June 7th. And you describe these places as good for the soul as we emerge from a pandemic. And I was going to ask for a preview. Thank you for giving us that preview of those places. You've had a focus clearly on Europe. I mean, your company is Rick Steves Europe. Do you have any plans to expand to other parts of the world?
No, I'm just going to stay focused on Europe. Europe is the wading pool for world exploration. My favorite places are beyond Europe in a lot of ways. I love India. I love Southeast Asia. I love Latin America. My son lives down in Colombia. If I was just traveling for kicks, I would branch out beyond Europe. But really, I've got a mission. I'm trying to help Americans get out there and get comfortable with the world. And I'm kind of practical. I'm a businessman. I need a big market. You know, if I wrote a guidebook to Burma, it would sell in the hundreds. If I write a guidebook to Paris, it's going to sell in the tens of thousands. It's a better choice that way. Plus, it's gratifying to have a lot of people use your work. My hope is that people have a good experience in Europe and then travel beyond Europe. So I've got a mission. I've got a responsibility because people like our brand and they expect good quality information. And I know just talking to some people on your staff before we got going today, a lot of travelers, and for 20, 30 years, you guys have been aware of my teaching. And I'm just really thankful for that. And I don't want to abuse that trust. And I've got, as I mentioned, I've got a wonderful staff of 100 people. And a big challenge for us coming out of COVID is going to be to get our guidebooks back up to date. My publisher came up just before COVID hit, and he's so excited about how our books were doing. And 25 out of the top 30 guidebooks published in the United States for European travel had Rick Steves on the cover. I mean, this is a huge responsibility to keep these books accurate and up to date. And now what? And they were just in such good shape when COVID hit. And of course, now the big scare for me is how many of the little mom and pop adventures, how many of the charming labors of love, little cafes and restaurants and trattorias and guest houses and artisans are still going to be standing after this. And we need to consume believing that we can shape the future of our world by who we patronize. And yes, big box stores are great. And I love getting a box of something 24 hours after I ordered on my doorstep. But do I want to do that at the expense of all the characteristic little entrepreneurial ventures that put the personality into our towns? Of course not. And I don't think people who are watching us now would like that either. What makes Europe so charming to me, and what makes Edmonds such a nice town to live in for me, is the fact that we have all of these entrepreneurial ventures vital and thriving. And when we go back to Europe, it's going to be like going to a village and seeing how many of your distant relatives are still alive after a disease swept through. How many of these businesses will still be standing? And I know from talking to my European friends that it's a dark, long time with no revenue when they've got rent to pay and staff to hold together. And I think they're eking out a survival by government aid and local patronage. But can they do that for one more winter? I don't know. Will enough travel come back this year to help them make it? I hope so. There'll be individuals coming back this summer and organized travel coming back, I think, early next year. And our business is going to be to wait until Europe is post-COVID before we waste our time researching the guidebooks. But once it's all settled of how devastating will COVID be to the business communities, then it's all hands on deck, as I'll take all my authors, co-authors, and researchers together to Europe in the spring, God willing, of 2022. And we're going to sweep through Europe and we're going to update all 50 of our guidebooks. And then it's not going to be anything fancy. We're just going to sweep out all the places that are no longer standing and make it cohesive and well-designed and get it to our publisher. And then they will go really working hard to get our guidebooks back out in the bookstores by late 2022, meaning by 2023, we will have honestly updated post-COVID guidebooks for people to travel with. In the meantime, a lot of people will be traveling in 2021 and 2022. And the honest fact is, there'll be no up-to-date information for them in the form of guidebooks. I don't even think it'll be available online, frankly. And what you need to do is get a guidebook that was good before COVID and recognize that it's a heck of a lot better than nothing at all, and be understanding that a lot of places that are recommended may not still be in business. So that's kind of my take on the guidebook situation coming out of COVID.
Yeah, we're all going to be making those discoveries when we finally get around to traveling.
Yeah.
Some places with really rich cultural assets are ruled by authoritarian, sometimes repressive governments. Myanmar comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Belarus comes to mind this week. Mm-hmm. How should travelers balance the gains they can make by visiting such rich cultural places with worries about financing repressive governments?
I'd almost be more concerned, Dean, about remembering that half of the planet is trying to live on $5 a day, and 10% of humanity is trying to live on under $2 a day. They're in what's called extreme poverty. And when I travel, I want my money to stay in the country, and I want it to be patronizing and supporting local businesses, rather than going to an internationally owned hotel with a golf course that's sucking water out of the parched land. So elites who jet in and jet out can have a cheap massage and a fancy buffet. So many Americans travel in a way that goes to an exotic country, but all the money stays in bank accounts of elite people from privileged countries. I love the idea of consuming locally when I travel and helping local economies. That's really, really important. Related to that is the question you brought up, Dean, about do you really want to patronize a country that has authoritarian government, or a government that is homophobic or racist, or not freedom of religion or whatever? You know, we went to Iran, and a lot of people say, how can you go to Iran and support that government? I think it's much more important. There's a much bigger advantage of Americans going to visit countries that are supposed to be the enemy, even if it means bringing some economy into that country, because then they get to know us and we get to know them. And that is accomplishing a heck of a lot. When I go to Cuba, when I go to Palestine, when I go to Iran, when I go to Egypt, when I go to Russia, I get to go to countries whose governments often demonize us. And when I go there personally, it makes it tougher for their propaganda to dehumanize me, and that accomplishes a lot. And then when I go home, it makes it tougher for my government to demonize them with our propaganda, and that accomplishes a lot too. So I really believe in the value of people-to-people travel, trumping anybody's concern about, oh, I'm going to an authoritarian regime. Am I helping that government? You're helping the people. And I think you're helping the people more by going there and letting them get to know us and us getting a better understanding of them. So that's my take on that. I wouldn't be too hung up on, do I agree with this government? There's a lot of governments that come and go. People need to know who we are. And when you go there, you inspire people. You let them know that America is different than whoever might be in the White House right now. And I'm one of them. And it's a beautiful thing.
Well, related to that, in addition to being a major travel writer, you've also been a strong activist for democracy in its many forms. And in a recent program, I was really struck by, you traveled through Germany to tell the story of the rise and fall of fascism in that country, and noted that this really offers lessons for democracies in the West that are being threatened by angry populist masses, wannabe autocrats. Can you tell us more about how thoughtful travel can be a weapon of democracy?
Well, it's more important now than I think any time in our lifetimes, as we have so many people dug into the extreme corners, left and right. And I know in our country, we tend, it's like a pendulum, and we swing. I think it's kind of like a boat on automatic pilot. It doesn't steer a straight course. It sets what's called acceptable parameters of deviation. You can swing this far and that far. And right now, our acceptable parameters of deviation are pretty wide, and it's just boom, boom, boom. And when we swing to the right, I think we flirt with getting close to fascism. And when we swing to the left, we flirt getting close to communism or something. And it's been a long time. I wanted to share what lessons Europe learned from fascism. Long before President Trump, I wanted to make this show. But when President Trump became our leader, I wanted people to understand that there are autocrats, wannabe autocrats on the left and on the right. It's not just, a liberal thing. It's people that care about democracy. If you have a wannabe autocrat that wants to derail democracy, we can learn how those autocrats did it back in the 1930s in Europe. It's amazing. Most of Europe was not democratic in the 1930s. It was ruled by fascists. And they all took power as if they were reading out of the same playbook. And it could be a left-winger or a right-winger, but they're autocrats reading out of the same playbook. So what I wanted to do was show that playbook and how it related to Hitler and Mussolini and Franco. And then I didn't even say the word any president or political character in the United States, but I let people kind of go, oh my goodness, is that happening in our country right now? And it's how you learn from history. And I think history is speaking to us. And I've got a degree in European history, so it helps me in my teaching. And I'm a tour guide, and I've spent a lot of time in Europe. And I just absolutely love to use the opportunity to travel as a classroom and to understand what you're looking at. So with my gig with public television, I get to take issues that I think are important, that smart, curious and caring Americans are steep on the learning curve that they should understand better. And then I get to design a 1-hour course in that issue through a traveler's lens. It's a beautiful thing. And I've been doing that for a long time. I did it in anticipation of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. I don't think people appreciate what an amazing thing Martin Luther did so long ago when he broke apart this whole idea that somebody else who can read Latin should be able to read the Bible for you. You know, he caused a lot of problems, and the religious wars that followed that were considered by a lot of people the First World War. But who is the Luther and who was the Reformation, and how can that be interesting? Well, that was my challenge, and the 500th anniversary of the Revolution or the Reformation only comes along every so often, and I got to make a TV show about it. I was also very concerned about Iran. I wanted to humanize Iran. How could 51% of this very influential and important society of 80 million people vote for a guy like Ahmadinejad? And what do Americans know about Iran? What I learned about Iran, and probably many people who are watching us right now, well, we learned from Ted Koppel with the Iran hostage crisis. And that's an embarrassment. That was a media circus. They hired these people to come in and shake their fist at the camera. They brought them in by the busloads, and we need to understand what makes the Iranians tick. So we went to Iran and made a show, and it's so exciting to be able to bring that home and share it. And I'm so thankful I've got public television that will let somebody do this. All over the country, people were angrily sending emails to their public television station saying, we're taking you out of our will. How dare you let Rick Steves be a Jane Fonda mouthpiece of the enemy? You know, they didn't want to really understand what motivates people. I'll never forget, on my last day of filming in Iran, a woman came up to me and she said, are you an American journalist? I said, yes. And she said, well, I want you to go home and tell the truth. We're strong, we're united, and we just don't want our little girls to be raised like Britney Spears. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's coming together now. Who voted for Ahmadinejad? It wasn't the sophisticated cosmopolitan people in the city. It was small town, less educated fundamentalists. Good people riddled by fear, driven by love, who really were worried that if there is a regime change, if somebody takes power in their government and changes their morality, their little girl will become a boy toy, a crass materialist, and a drug addict. That's what motivated people to vote for Ahmadinejad and support Ayatollah Khomeini. And to this day, they, by choice, have traded away their democracy to have a theocracy, because they don't want their little girls to become boy toys. Now, we may say, oh, get over it, you know, but if you raised your kids under the Shah and you were a fundamentalist Muslim in a small town, and you know that Shah was a puppet of the United States, you would be very, very concerned about incursions from the West. They don't even think about oil. That's what motivates us. They think about, during the Shah's time, they were bragging that the miniskirts are shorter in Tehran than they are in Paris. That's a big deal. So there's that kind of sensibility you get when you travel to a place that you'd never get by looking at it through the lens of commercial news. So we got to do the same thing about the Holy Land. And I've been thinking about that a lot this last couple of weeks with what's going on in Gaza. But we did a 1-hour show with a dual narrative approach to the Holy Land. That is the 14 million people that live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, split up between Israel and Palestine. There's 7 million Jews and there's 7 million Muslims. And they got to sort it out. I say there's 7 million Jews, there's 9 million people in Israel. Roughly 7 million of them are Jewish and a couple million are Palestinian Israelis. And then there's 5 million people in Palestine and they're Muslims. And you put it together and it's 50-50. And you can't just put your Muslims in a cage. You're going to have a tough time doing that. And it's not good for Israel. And when you have a wall, sure, maybe that wall is necessary to keep the terrorists out. But the unintended consequence of that wall is to keep the young people on both sides of that wall unable to talk to each other. And then they're saddled with their parents' baggage and they get nowhere to sort this out. And it's a fascinating challenge for a caring American to get into. And whether we like it or not, we are a stakeholder in this. You know, we pay for the bombs that Israel rains down on Gaza, and then we'll pay for the reconstruction. And it'll happen again and again and again. And we all want Israel to be safe and secure. But what is the best way? An apartheid state, a pluralistic democracy, or two states? You got to choose. There's only three options when you think about the Holy Land: two states, apartheid state, or pluralistic democracy. If you don't have two states, then you got a choice. It's going to be Israel as an apartheid or as a pluralistic democracy. Israel doesn't want to be an apartheid state, but its only option if they don't have two states will be that or a pluralistic democracy. And if they're a pluralistic democracy, demographics make it very clear. It's 7 million to 7 million now. Palestinians are growing at a lot faster rate than the Jews. And you're going to have no more Jewish Israeli state going forward. Consequently, when Israel and the United States makes the two-state solution unworkable, the only way to have a Jewish Israeli state is the status quo. And it's not politically correct to call it apartheid, but have you been to the West Bank? Do you know what it's like to live in a country with no control of your borders, with no coastline, with no airport, with no control of your water, with a tenfold difference in per capita income? It's like going from San Diego to Tijuana, but twice as stark. I've walked through that gate many times with Palestinians who have to go to Israel to earn a living cutting somebody's grass. And it's just no way to build a real peace. So these are complicated challenges. But what I got to do was travel on both sides and share what I call a dual narrative approach to the problem, offending both sides just about equally. I had people on both sides angry with me, and that was a fun project. The other one we did was just recently. We spent time in Guatemala and Ethiopia, and I've long wanted to help Americans better understand the economics of poverty. Why, with such amazing affluence on this planet, is half of humanity living on less than $5 a day? And worse than that, why is 10% of humanity trying to live on $2 a day? That's extreme poverty. And could we solve that? Could we spend what we spent on Afghanistan to fight extreme poverty and eradicate hunger? And you wouldn't do it because you love your neighbor. America doesn't do that. You have to do it for economic reasons. You got to do it for selfish security reasons. Okay, so you can love your neighbor. That would motivate most of us, of course. But you could also make an excuse for that investment in just making the world a safer and more stable place. So what I wanted to do was illustrate how foreign aid, taxpayer American dollars going to places like Ethiopia to help people not be desperately poor is a good practical investment. And we illustrated that. And what we did was we wanted to show how modern aid is more smart than your grandmother's aid. You know, in the old days, aid made people dependent. Today, aid is designed to make people independent, and it's exciting. And so many Americans are predisposed just to discredit aid. You know, you're just throwing it away. They'll just have more kids. But there's serious sociology and science and economics in this, and there's serious security concerns. And we produced a 1-hour show called Hunger and Hope, Lessons Learned in Ethiopia and Guatemala. That really was an exciting challenge for us as a TV crew. And we aired it all over the United States on public television, and it's still airing right now. And if you haven't seen any of these shows, if they're are all interesting to you, all of my shows are available for free and just a click away at ricksteves.com. But that one about the Holy Land is really timely right now. And the one about hunger and hope, I think, is also very timely. And it's just, it gives my job so much more meaning because I still consider myself a tour guide and a teacher. And what I get is the best classroom anywhere, and to put it on TV thanks to public television, and then a chance to talk about it like right now.
An excellent use of the media to promote democracy.
You know, it's funny you say that, Dean, because when I get a letter that's handwritten, it's usually from a crackpot, to be honest. And I look at it for a moment and then I don't give it a lot of thought. And I got a handwritten letter a few years ago, and I can't even read this. What's it all about? And I only caught my eye and I read it. And then at the very bottom, it said Bill Moyers. And Bill Moyers, who's my idol in so many ways, I didn't even know he knew me. And he sent me this handwritten letter. And he said, Rick, you're doing what we should all be doing with the media. The media is a way to broaden our perspectives and inspire us to be engaged and smarter and more caring. And I put that in a frame and I've got it hanging in my office. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to help make media a good thing. And that's one reason I spend a good part of my energy when I'm not traveling supporting public television. It's a big deal. I think we contribute quite a lot in these silly pledge drives, to help raise money. And that gives us, I think, an oasis on the dial that is not commercial. It's not advertiser driven. I'm thankful for all the commercial TV. I love it, but I'm really also thankful there's that one place on the dial where we can assume an attention span and respect people's intelligence and make programming driven, not by a passion for what's good for advertisers, but by a passion for just inspiring people to reach out there and celebrate the world in all its diversity. And I'm getting into a pledge drive now, so I'll.
We're getting a number of questions from our audience. One that I was planning to ask, but which someone has already asked here, is clearly much good comes from enlightened travel, but we have to balance that good that comes from traveling with damage that can be done to the environment through jet travel. Now, your company has taken a pretty creative approach to that by imposing upon yourself your own carbon tax. How does that work?
Yeah, you can talk about being an environmentalist and green and all that kind of stuff, but if you're in tourism, you're contributing mightily to the problem. Now, some people can be flight shamed out of their travels. Airplanes are pouring carbon into the atmosphere. It's making the whole place warm up. Well, it's true. But instead of not traveling, you can do what I consider, what is mitigation. If you create that much bad, you can create this much good, and you become carbon neutral. And I think this is just science. And what I decided is I'm making too much money by not having to pay my way from a carbon point of view. I don't brag about this. I'm doing nothing heroic. I'm doing what businessmen should be required to do if we had more honest accounting in our country that made people pay for their carbon impact on climate change. And we don't do that for various reasons. But what I do in the interim until we come to our senses in that regard is I have my own self-imposed carbon tax. And I did some studying. There's some great work out on this. And it takes $30 smartly invested in carbon offsets to make my flight from Seattle to Europe and back carbon neutral. Okay. So I profited from 30,000 people taking a Rick Steves tour in 2019. And I made $30 too much money to be on it, called that honest profit per person. And I thought, I'm going to take that money and tax myself and then invest it in a way that mitigates that carbon. So you take 30,000 times $30, it's $900,000. You round it up to $1 million. Yeah, decide you're going to give 10 good organizations a $100,000 grant, and they are going to use that money to help the environment to the point where the people you took to Europe can honestly say we flew there and back in a carbon neutral way. Again, that's just nothing heroic. It's just ethical. So what we did is we created this thing called the Rick Steves Climate Smart Initiative. The conventional way for a businessman to be green would be to buy first world carbon offsets. But I wanted to help the developing world at the same time I was going to help the environment. So we took that money, and rather than buying conventional carbon offsets, we invested it in what is called climate smart agriculture in the third world. Half of humanity is smallholder family farmers in the developing world trying to eke out an existence. They are contributing mightily to climate change, just like we privileged wealthy people are. And if we can help them do their farming and feed their kids and get some extra produce to market to make some extra money, and at the same time contribute less to climate change, that's a good thing. And also that can be tied in with forestry because we need to take care of the forests. So We found 10 organizations. We gave them each $100,000, and reading the results of that last year was so inspirational that last year, even though we took nobody to Europe, we didn't have the heart not to continue supporting them. So we gave 50% of our normal self-imposed carbon tax, even though we had no income to generate that. And I'm so proud of this. Right at the top of that program, Dean, you may have noticed if you looked on my website, it says, if you're a tour organizer, please steal this program and do not credit us. We've just got to get honest in the tourism industry and pay for our carbon as we go. It's not that tough. And any individual who wants to go on their trip, Europe or Asia or whatever, and back, if they want to see my favorite 10 organizations, all of them are doing great work. And in COVID, their work is more important than ever. And all of them would be happy to accept $30 from you. And then you can give yourself that carbon tax. And I hope feel better about your next trip.
An interesting solution. Another question. How are you finding and how do you think Brexit has and will affect travel from Americans to Europe?
Britain pulled out of the European Union, but most Americans don't even know which countries are in the European Union. I don't think Norway's in the European Union. There are countries that are not in. Switzerland, I don't think, is in the European Union. And they manage with the inefficiencies and the freedoms that come with not being in the EU. The question is, how big should the European Union be? I like the European Union in the sense that, well, the two reasons for the European Union, it creates a free trade zone so that economic union can compete with other free trade zones like the United States, India, and China in a global way. You need to have that big free trade zone for that efficiency. But more importantly, the European Union, and this is what motivated people back in the 40s when they decided to work in this direction, after digging out for the second time in their lifetimes after a war, essentially between France and Germany, the European Union is designed to weave the economies of France and Germany together so a war in the future would be inconceivable. It would make no sense. And that's what the European Union has done. So you can have all sorts of complaints about the bureaucracy and the political correctness and the inefficiencies of the European Union. But what it has done, it's created that big free trade zone, all those people with the same coins jangling in their pockets, the euro and so on. And you will have now a future where Europe will never be embroiled in a big war like that had been routine throughout history until the last 50 years. So I'm enthusiastic about the European Union. Now, the question I said is, how big should it be? They got on a roll and they started adding all sorts of people, but maybe Britain should not be in there. It's up to the British. The British don't like a fisherman in Cornwall or a farmer in Cumbria doesn't want bureaucrats in Belgium to tell them what are their restrictions. So now they've got a bureaucrat in London telling them what their restrictions are. It's still going to be problematic, but it's less problematic than if you have Spaniards and Greeks telling the English what to do. The consequence for the English people, I think, is going to be huge. I think Great Britain is not going to be, they're going to have to just call it Britain going forward. It's not going to be as great. And I do think that Scotland voted to stay with England in the United Kingdom, assuming the UK would be part of the EU. The Scottish have always been have a bigger affinity for France and the continent than the English. And it was palatable to be ruled by London as long as they were part of the EU. Suddenly, it's a bait and switch. Scotland voted to stay with London because London was part of Belgium or Brussels in the EU. Suddenly, London says, we're no longer part of the EU. And Scotland goes, well, wait a minute. We didn't vote to stay with you. We voted to stay with you as part of the EU. Scotland has a very good case now for wanting to re-litigate that question with another vote. And if Scotland breaks away, then what's going to happen with Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland's not going to be ruled by London. Northern Ireland's going to see the efficiency of being with the Republic of Ireland, which has a good relationship with the EU and will profit hugely because of its relationship with the EU, especially with Britain pulling out. And Northern Ireland will have an incentive and a good case to be made for joining the Republic. So you may have a united Ireland, you may have an independent Scotland, and then what's left? England and Wales. That's a huge consequence for Britain. So I would be, if I was a progressive urban English person, I'd be pretty upset. Remember, all over Europe, when you look at these issues, the autocracies in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, the issues of Brexit and so on, it is the same urban-rural design, the divide you see in the United States between red and blue political areas. Look at a map of the United States. No state is completely red or blue. It is rural, small town, and big cities. So that's the same dynamic in Europe. It's perfectly analogous, I think. What is the impact on travel? I don't think it's going to be impact at all. I love to go to Europe and see history unfolding. We're part of it, and it's an exciting time to travel. I honestly, I mean, there's more borders, more border formalities. That's the problem. And I've noticed over 40 years of traveling, as societies become more expansive and more open and more working together, borders fade away. And then as they bicker and they fall apart and they have more fear-mongering and more autocracy, you get more borders. So we see that ebb and flow. And with the EU, you didn't get stamps in your passport anymore. People say, how many stamps do you got in your passport? Not very many, because I'm usually just crossing borders in Europe, and you have a tough time talking, if you can find a border guard into stamping your passport when you go to between countries in the EU. But now you will have a border, a major border between Britain and Europe. Will you still be able to go from Big Ben to the Eiffel Tower in 2.5 hours, 12 times a day for $100 on the English Channel Tunnel, 17 minutes under the English Channel? Yes, you'll still be able to hop on that train in London and have a nice breakfast and get to Paris in time for lunch.
So more stamps in our passports then.
That's kind of it, yeah.
Another question from our audience. Countries like ours have been accused of hoarding vaccines. Do we have a responsibility to the global community to share our vaccines?
You know, when you travel, if you travel with your eyes open and your window down and an eagerness to learn what are the honest realities out there, you realize how the world is so divided when we are so privileged. Of course, we got to divide within our country, but if you look between countries, there are the privileged countries and there are the developing countries and the struggling countries. And my whole focus is Europe and America. When can we fly across the Atlantic? When can I go to Germany? When can I hike in the Alps? When can I have my cappuccino in Italy? That's a rich region to rich region. And we are going to be traveling together because we're going to all be vaccinated, God willing. What about the southern, what do you call it, the global south? What about all the developing world? Well, just stand by. Us rich people are getting vaccinated first. Okay, that's just the reality. We're privileged. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's fair. But the reality is people are selfish and privileged people have a tough time giving that up. So here's, I think, the best scenario if you want to be real and pragmatic and honest about what are our values and the privacy of the voting booth. Rich countries will get vaccinated, and then we have to be honest and smart about the fact that the job's not done. You know, because you could whoop the pandemic here, but if it's still raging south of the border, it can get a variant and swoop back in, and you thought you were safe, but you weren't. And I think one of the corona bonuses of this time is going to be going forward. We're going to realize that the challenges facing us are no longer going to be susceptible to conventional weaponry, and they'll be blind to borders. And we still just reflexively spend $700 billion a year on military hardware. It's kind of embarrassing from a practical point of view that we don't assess who is our enemy anymore. And we still spend $700 billion on military hardware, conventional weaponry. Of course, we need military hardware and conventional weaponry, but what are the big risks facing us? And I think going forward, those risks are going to be, again, risks that need science and need good governance and need nations working together to defend against. And in the future, you won't have win-lose solutions. You got to have win-win solutions, or it's going to be ultimately lose-lose. And this pandemic is a good example of that. So long-winded answer, Dean, to your question, we have a moral and a practical obligation as privileged, highly industrialized, highly advanced societies with more money than we know what to do with, to be honest. We have a big responsibility to make sure that we follow through and help the developing world get fully vaccinated. It's totally realistic. Generally, when it comes to these kind of ethical issues, the United States is outvoted 150 to 5 or something like that in the United Nations. I don't know the exact numbers, but typically we are the ones dragging our feet at these global initiatives. And I think that the world is going to recognize we've got to follow through and vaccinate the people in the developing world. And it's going to be a few years before people will be able to travel freely in the poor world like we will this year within the rich world. New Zealand and Australia, I understand, already have their bubble. You know, that's a nice privileged bubble, and everybody there is vaccinated and they can travel between each other. So it'll be a couple of years, and I hope and pray that the rich world sees the ethics and the practicality of that.
Okay, one last question before we let you go. Two-part question. First part, what traits can we cultivate as travelers that allow for meaningful connections between people from other countries and cultures? Second part, what are the biggest mistakes Americans make when they travel to Europe?
You know, I've been stuck home for more than a year now, and I've got more media and interviews and so on from national magazines and TV and so on than I ever get when I'm actually doing what I do. They're curious about how's the travel guy doing when he can't travel. And what I say is, I've been, you know, you got to play the cards you're dealt, and we can't travel right now. So I'm enjoying this little sabbatical. This whole COVID time for me has been, you know, kind of God's way of saying, slow down. It's sort of therapy for a workaholic and reminding me there's more to life than increasing its speed. And I've developed this sort of life skill of employing a traveler's mindset right here at home when I'm not traveling. So I think, what is a good traveler? A good traveler is curious. A good traveler is open-minded. A good traveler wants to do new things and make mistakes, learn from them. You know, just when an opportunity presents itself, you say, yeah, I'll give that a whirl. And I've been doing that right here at home. And it's been, for me, really fun. I've learned how to cook. I've learned why people love dogs. I've became more tuned into the fragility of our environment. For me, every sunset is sort of like a devotional. I've been thinking a lot about the divide in our society within our country and between our country and south of the border, and how privileged we are, and how even if you're motivated only by greed, you don't want to be filthy rich in a desperately poor world. It's just not a nice place to raise your kids. So that's been then sort of my mindset during this COVID time. I think that going forward, when we come out of COVID, I hope that we carry some of that with us. The big question is, will we flop right back into our busy kind of consumerist world of travel, or will we travel in a way that is a little more intentional, a little more mindful of why we travel? The value of travel has never been greater. The power of media to make us fearful and to shape our impressions has never been greater. And the opportunities to learn from our travels, I think, are huge. Did that answer your first question, Dean?
Yes, yes.
And the second question was
biggest mistakes Americans make when they travel to Europe.
I think, well, I try to learn from my mistakes when I travel. That's sort of the basis of my whole teaching. And I think one thing is, a lot of people take care of their money, forgetting that their time is a limited resource also. Remember in the old days, Arthur Fromer wrote a book called Europe on $5 a day. And the whole idea was taking care of your money. But, you know, we have the shortest vacations in the rich world, and time is a precious resource also. And a taxi ride that will save you half an hour, regardless of how much that taxi ride costs, if you figure out what's your time worth while you're on vacation with your family, that taxi ride could be a very good budget tip. So if you do things that save time, if you do things that enhance the experience, I've learned, I learned too late, but I've learned that the most beautiful splurge for me is hiring a local guide. I just took my family to Cuba a couple of years ago, and the best investment we made was spending $100 a day in a country where $100 is the average monthly wage on having a guide, a good local guide. That was a good gig for this kid. He met us at our bed and breakfast every morning at breakfast. He was our friend, our navigator, our comedian, our negotiator, our historian, our everything. And he tucked us in at night. And it cost us $25 each to have that guide for the day. That was a good investment. Equip yourself with good information, whether it's a living guide or a guidebook. Of course, I write guidebooks. I'm a good salesperson on those. Guidebooks are $20 tools for $3,000 experiences. If your guidebook's any good, it'll pay for itself on the shuttle in from the airport, you know. So equip yourself with good information, expect yourself to travel smart. Remember, I can't help you find a cheap way to see the Roman aqueduct outside of Avignon, the Pont du Gard. Everybody's going to pay $10 for it. But I can help you get more out of the experience, because everybody pays $10 and most people that go there don't even know what an aqueduct is. And if you have a good guide or a good guidebook and you use it, you'll understand that that aqueduct is not an aqueduct. It's the most scenic bridge highlighting the biggest round arch the Romans ever built as part of a 30-mile long structure designed by Romans and engineered to take water from this source to that town using gravity instead of people's sweat. And it's engineered to lose 1 inch every 100 yards for 30 miles. Now you look at that aqueduct and you go, wow, let's step into the museum and learn how they did it and why. And then follow that up by going to Nîmes, the end point of that 30-mile long structure built 1,800 years ago, and look at the hole where the water gushed out, and imagine the jubilation on that day so long ago when water rushed into the city of Nîmes. And then you think, yeah, Nîmes got beat by Rome. That was a drag, but now they're on the winning team. They've got stability, they've got infrastructure, they've got running water. It helps you go back in time. And that little bit of guiding, I mean, I just had fun there riffing on an aqueduct for 3 minutes, but for so many people, there's not a hint of that in their travels. And I find that powerful forces in our society would find it convenient and, to be honest, more profitable if we're all just dumbed down. Just go shopping, duty-free shopping, frequent flyer miles, fun in the sun. What's the power of your sunscreen? And it numbs us to the value of travel. And of course, you're going to have fun in the sun, but think of a way where travel can challenge you and broaden your perspective, be truly transformational. People in tourism throw around that word a lot, transformational. I take it seriously. You know, when somebody goes on a Rick Steves tour or uses a Rick Steves guidebook or watches a Rick Steves TV show, I hope it helps make travel transformational, because we need that. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's fun for me to have a chance to share these ideas. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to enthuse about how lucky I am to find my niche as a travel teacher and to live in a corner of our country that is so curious. I always love living in the Northwest. People say, what do you love about it? Well, for one reason, the citizenry here really is open to the world. I mean, this is a part of the United States where Kathmandu is a household word. And I really like that, because there's a lot of our country where Kathmandu is, what's that? You know, so we should be thankful for that, and we should embrace that, and we should be continue to be open to the world. So.
Well, Rick, I know you have another commitment. I want to thank you for an informative and inspirational program. And if we were meeting in person, no doubt you would be hearing thunderous applause right about now.
Nice.
So thank you very much. To our audience, thank you for questions. We got to as many of them as we could. Some of them Rick seemed to have answered already, looking ahead into our minds. I'll just remind everyone that the June program coming up on June 23rd, Ambassador James Collins will be here. And today's program will be available on video in the coming days. So I invite you to share it with your friends, tell them about it, and tell them how much you enjoyed this program. I know I certainly did. Thanks very much, Rick Steves. Thanks to the audience. Have a great Memorial Day weekend, everyone.
Happy travels. Thanks.